Hello, everybody. Menopause Taylor here, bringing you the state of menopause in the world today. And we are in the midst of a big old unit on heart attacks. Yes. It's an education on menopause. And one of the most important topics is heart attacks. And that's because heart attacks kill 1 out of every 2 women. They are the biggest killer of all women. Biggest killer of postmenopausal women, and unfortunately most postmenopausal women know nothing about heart attacks. Well, if you're listening to my podcast, you won't be one of those women. So I've been talking about heart attacks, and today we're going to talk about the role of sugar in causing heart attacks. That's it. So it's so sweet of you to join me today. And I'm going to teach you all the sweet, sour, and indifferent things about menopause. And that's why we're going to talk about sweet things today. So you should know that I have a book, and it's available on Amazon.com and at my website, menopausetailer.me. And it has a whole chapter in it on heart attacks. And chapter 28 is the chapter in the book. And you know, it is wonderful to have the book to go alongside with whatever else you're doing to learn about menopause, whether it's these podcasts or my YouTube channel or watching my webinars. Whatever you do, use the book alongside, because you will get so much more of an education if you learn things consecutively and you have both the book and the other options to get to advance your learning. So in the last podcast, I taught you all the details about fats, also called lipids. And you know, everyone naturally associates fat with heart attacks, which of course is entirely logical, but that's not all there is to it. So today, I'm going to provide you with the missing link, which is sugar. Now, right now, you're probably thinking that I'm confusing heart attacks with diabetes. I'm not. We're talking about heart attack, and I'm going to explain the role that sugar plays in causing a heart attack. You know that I always tell you the truth, and that the truth always makes sense. And today is no different. So the reason that this podcast is so important is that, as with so many other things in the world of menopause, you have been misled about sugar. If you don't learn the truth, that one oversight could be the very reason you have a heart attack. So let's start with a bit of history. You know, heart attacks have not always been the number one killer of both men and women. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the incidence of heart attacks began to rise. And naturally, when a disease rises in incidence, people start looking for its cause. So that's when the quest to find the cause of heart attacks began. Now, around that same time, there was an ongoing quest to determine the cause of cavities in our teeth. And sugar was found to be the culprit in causing cavities. So great strides were made in reducing cavities. Fluoride was added to water, and people were taught that sugar rots your teeth. But you know, it's a funny thing. Once people discover the cause of a disease, it's like they file it away and fail to consider it as the culprit in causing some other disease. It's as if they assume that each causative agent can only be attached to one disease. But as you'll see over and over and over in my tutorials, usually one agent causes many diseases. But it wasn't until 1970 that fat became the culprit in causing heart attacks. A man by the name of Ansel Keys published studies showing that the best fed people, in other words, the meat eaters, had the most heart attacks. And because animal products are the primary source of fat, fat became the bad guy when it comes to causing heart attacks. Now, if you're of menopausal age, you're old enough to recall the 1970s. That's when suddenly there was a low-fat movement. Everyone started focusing on fat and only fat. That's when margarine was promoted instead of butter. It's when solid Crisco shortening was replaced by liquid vegetable oils. It's when you started seeing low-fat milk and skim milk. So in the 1970s and continuing until the present day, the food industry modified its products to meet the demand for lower fat in our diets. And it took the fat out of foods. But you know what? When you take the fat out of food, the food tastes like cardboard. So, to compensate for the fact that low-fat food tasted like cardboard, the food industry began adding sugar. And of course, sugar tastes good. So you started seeing products like Snackwells, those cookies. Before the low-fat movement, Snackwells had 3 grams of fat per serving. But then Nabisco removed 2 grams of fat per serving. But in the place of those 2 grams of fat, they added 4 grams of sugar. So now there are 7 grams of sugar per serving. And 1 serving is 1 cookie. I don't know about you, but I think most of us would eat the whole package of 3 or 4 or 6 or however many there are, or maybe we eat 2 or 3 packages. But have you noticed that the obesity pandemic has occurred since the low-fat movement began? Look around you. Regardless of where you live, you see more obese people now than ever before. The percentage of obese humans has doubled in the last 28 years. And the increased risk for heart attack is rising faster than the increase in obesity. For the first time in history, even people who live in poverty are obese. And 30% more people who are obese are actually undernourished. The low-fat movement was supposed to decrease the incidence of heart attacks. It didn't. Not only that, it increased the rate of heart attacks, the incidence of obesity, and the incidence of diabetes. So why hasn't anyone noticed that we're focusing on the wrong thing? You see, I pay attention to patterns like this. I look at common practices. I observe how they are serving or disserving their purpose, and I figure out the problem with the logic that created the situation in the first place. Well, it turns out that at the same time Ansel Keys published studies targeting fat as the culprit in causing heart attacks, another man published studies targeting sugar as the culprit in causing heart attacks. But by that time, people already associated sugar with cavities, and they just couldn't seem to grasp that sugar might also be at fault for causing heart attacks too. Like I said, we humans are strange that way. Once we have this notion in our heads, we find it difficult to shake it. So this other guy's name was John Yudkin. He published studies showing that sugar consumption was associated with heart attacks. But for some odd reason, the governments latched on to fat as the culprit. And in the 1970s, the government recommended limitation of total fat intake to 30% and saturated fat intake to 10%. And nothing has changed since then. The research on sugar was pushed to the wayside while people got fatter and fatter and fatter and had increased rates of heart attacks that coincided with the increase in obesity. So I'm here to inform you that sugar causes heart attacks. Bah humbug, you say? Well, just think about it. Sugar makes you fat. And when you're fat, you develop type 2 diabetes. And when you develop type 2 diabetes, it puts you at very high risk of heart attack. They're all connected. Dietary fat is no longer the biggest problem. It's sugar. And sugar causes heart attacks in another way, too. It's metabolized and stored as fat. Not only that, sugar is addictive. Once your taste buds are trained to crave sugar, and once you get a high from eating sugar, your body thinks it needs sugar. It's just like a drug addict who craves and needs drugs. The drug takes over. It governs everything else. That's what has happened to the sugar that is added to food. If you start reading ingredients on food packages, you'll be shocked at how many things have added sugar. You know, I was in the U.S. buying ground flax seeds one day. I was in Whole Foods of all places, and I habitually read every label and every list of ingredients on every package. And the flax seeds had sugar in them. Now, the problem is, you probably won't recognize most of the added sugars, and that's because they are hidden. There are hidden sugars in different forms. You know, there are actually 56 different types of sugar. The problem is, most people don't know that. And the key to these sugars, fructose, is the sugar that causes heart attacks. And in the list of 56 different types of sugars, there's only 16 that do not contain fructose. That's terrible. And the list of sugars doesn't even contain any of the non-caloric sweeteners like sucralose, saccharin, or aspartame. But if you look at a nutrition label, the one thing it does not list is added sugar. And that's the most important piece of information at all, but it's not there. So you have no way of knowing how much of the sugar content is added. And if you're wondering why added sugar is more important than natural sugar, it's because naturally occurring sugar does not cause heart attacks. In fact, naturally occurring sugar only comes from 4 sources, period. Sugarcane, fruit, vegetables, and honey. That's it. And if you think about the quantity of sugar that these natural sources contain, or if you think about the task of finding them in nature, they're all very hard to get. I mean, it's definitely not easy to get sugar out of sugarcane, and you have to fruits and vegetables in order to get the sugar they contain, and you have to fight bees to get to natural honey. But the food industry has made sugar very easy to get. In fact, they've added it to everything. In fact, it's impossible for you to avoid it. You can't even avoid sugar if you want to. Nowadays, fructose is in everything. High fructose corn syrup is the first ingredient in the majority of foods. But fructose